Nope. So you guys know before you can start taking final horses, you have to do a 14-minute pair of feet trimmed. So that's something that you guys should be considering. Before you can take midterms, it's a prerequisite, and it's something I'd encourage you guys all to start thinking about it. So the idea isn't necessarily just throw it at the wall until it sticks, but do something and practice that thing until you're better at it. Then try again, right? So do your run, see where your weaknesses are, what you need to improve on, and then really practice on the thing that got you, and then try again. The throw it at the wall and stick method is not the way to pass your final horses. Caroline did something that I also wouldn't recommend. And she waited until like the last week to start doing final horses. When did you start doing final horses?
4 weeks.
Oh yeah.
Caroline, how many final horses did you do?
4 weeks. I did 4 or 5. Huh.
You'll be pretty lucky if you only do 4 or 5. But understand that when you do your run, the reason for doing it is a practice. So even when you don't pass a run, it doesn't mean that you failed. It just means that you did fail that run, but you haven't failed. What you've done is it's a practice run until you succeed, right? And you're going to be expected to have a lot of practice runs. There we go.
Does anybody ever pass the first one?
Yep.
One guy like Jacob. Yeah.
Passing it the first run isn't that hard.
It's just having all the skills before well practiced.
Exactly. Yeah, if that's like the goal, if that's what you wanted to do, what you would do is you would do 14-minute trims until you were perfect at them. And then you build 25-minute pairs until you were perfect at them. And then you would practice your fitting and you would do all the parts and then you just execute it all at the same time. But what most people do is they take it before they're quite ready, which is, I wouldn't wait until the last week because you weren't perfectly ready. You need to start taking them as soon as you can, really. Yeah, if you're not, you have to be a pretty self-disciplined person to do what I'm talking about. Like you would have to know that you had marks that you were hitting as you went through. All right. Cool. So first thing, what we can see, look at the vascular system. You guys see that? How neat is that? So we took just a second, and that right there is called your coronary venous plexus, is what's being exposed there. Okay? As we look at the dorsal aspect, we can start to see our extensor tendons, right? But what's always amazing to me is look at how far around the lateral side our extensor tendons are. You guys see that? So if we think about how much mass, depending on how much that tendon has to move, will depend on how far down the center line something is. Okay, so if we look right here, you guys see that little piece going in and out? That's your extensor carpi radialis. Okay, so if I peel that back, we'll be able to see that. Where does it insert? It inserts right down the center median of the line of that foot, or that leg, right? So if it's inserting there, it has to extend everything from our carpus distally, okay? But that makes sense that needs to be right down the center. And that's that big, right there on the forearm of the horse, that big thing, that's what that is your extensor carpi radialis. It's a pretty impressive muscle. But again, it's down the center line. When we think about what our main extensor and our lateral extension, they're only gonna have to deal with the digit, right? So it makes sense that they don't have to be right down the center line, okay? So the main extensor is going to be the one more down center. It's going to originate your main extensor muscle, course distad, insert into proximal P1, proximal P2, and the extensor process of P3, which is a little triangle that sticks up. We can also start to see our suspensory ligament. See how it's coming down and inserting to our main extensor tendon about a third of the way down, or about right at our pastern? And then our lateral extensor tendon is all the way almost on the palmar aspect of the carpus. You guys see that? It comes down and it's going to insert into proximal P1. On the hind limb, that's the exception to the muscle to bone rule in the way that it inserts into the main extensor tendon about a third of the way down the cannon. Okay. I'm going to spend just a second. I'm going to go ahead and start cleaning up these collateral cartilages a little bit so that you guys can really see one of them at least. And I'm going to clean up our annular ligaments. Okay. So I'm going to spend just a second right here. So right now I'm separating this annular ligament. This is the proximal digital annular ligament. And once I cut this fascia back, what I'm going to expose is going to be my suspensory or my sesamoid ligaments. So like right there, what we're seeing is our oblique sesamoid ligament.
Oblique is middle or
Superficial.
oh.
So what we see right here, this is our palmar annular ligament right here, underneath those scissors. You guys see that? Then we can start to see here is our proximal digital annular ligament. And you can see here, I cut off the one side on your guys' left-hand side. This is the distal end of our proximal digital annular ligament, okay? This is laying right over, right here is our superficial flexor tendon. You guys see that? And you can see how our proximal digital annular ligament sits right there. Okay, so proximal end of the proximal digital, distal end, superficial, and you can start to see, look at how the deep flexor tendon changes in shape. You guys see how it becomes two lobes? Okay, so it has a lobular shape. So like if you look at the navicular bone, it's going to have two what called navicular fossas. They're going to have little cups to them, and that's where each one of those lobes will set in that. Okay, so that fossa, that ridge down the center separates your deep flexor tendon, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut our annular ligament off. I'm going to cut it right down the center here. And what you're going to see is that, so the scutum, in Dad's book, you're going to see the intersesamoid ligament. It's kind of drawn as that hyperbolic parabola that makes up the that groove between the sesamoids, right? That shape that looks like a Pringle. All right. Let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and resect back our tendons and expose our suspensory ligament. So right here, this is going to be our carpal canal that I'm cutting through. So if you think about your anatomy, right? So you guys can see this is our lateral side here. Did you guys notice how whenever I went to cut right on that medial aspect? So think about the shape of your accessory carpal. Your accessory carpal sits right here. So what side is a horse likely to get kicked on? What side is it going to need to protect the carpal canal? So that accessory carpal comes around and cups around that like so. But it protects that carpal canal. Okay? So now as I cut this back this side, this will expose our flexor tendons. It's also going to expose our inferior check ligament. Now when you hear the word inferior and superior, it doesn't actually have anything to do with size and function. What makes it inferior or superior has everything to do with location. So the more dorsal or more proximal something is, that'll be superior. So like your supraspinatus and infraspinatus muscles, when you hear about those, they are, that is entirely locational. So right now I'm cutting accessory carpal. That accessory carpal has several tendons and muscles that insert into it. Your ulnaris lateralis, your flexor carpi and ulnaris, they both insert right into the proximal end of that accessory carpal. So it changes the direction of pull by being further away from the point of articulation, and they're actually really important for the flexion of the carpal joints. Okay, so I've got two tendons here, right? So this one here is going to be our superficial flexor tendon, right? That's our deep flexor tendon. What do we have right here? Anyone? Subcarpal check ligament or inferior check ligament? Yep. So we can start to see, look, that's a pretty good sized ligament, isn't it? Okay, I'm gonna take just a second here. So how many of you guys have a really good idea what the origin of your suspensory ligament looks like? Yeah?
Proximal cannon distal row of carpals.
Yep.
But I don't know exactly.
And would you guys think it's all one tendon, or do you guys think it's gonna have like almost muscle heads?
Muscle heads.
Yeah. What we're gonna talk about now is your superficial flexor tendon. Do you guys see how it creates that ring around your deep flexor tendon?
Manica flexoria.
Exactly, the manica flexoria. So what's the purpose of that, right? So let's think about function of those things. So before I cut that inferior check ligament off, can you guys see how that'd be part of the passive stay apparatus? It's gonna hold tension on that deep flexor tendon. That's also gonna keep it from ever hyperextending or overextending the deep flexor tendon muscles, right? It's also gonna give, if you think about ligaments having some elasticity, whenever this descends, that's actually what's gonna stretch. Our deep flexor tendon is gonna stay rigid, and that's gonna stretch. Now, anytime that I have a piece passed over the top, think about it if I were to toss if we had a beam here, and I tossed a rope over it and it tied to one of you guys. As I pulled on that rope, what would happen to the rope? It would fray, right? So how could I protect my rope? Well, I could lubricate it, so I could put oil on my beam. I could put a piece of leather on my beam so that when I pulled on the rope, it was riding on something soft. I could create a piece of cable that rode right in between there, right on the beam, so that would wear better. So we have levels of this, right? So the lubrication is going to be our synovial sheath or synovial fluid. So our synovial fluid is going to be made on the synovial membrane. The synovial membrane is going to be on the inside of a capsular ligament. It's also going to be on like the inside of a synovial sheath, okay? It's a dialysis blood plasma and a mucopolysaccharide called hyaluronic acid made of proteinases, collagenases, and lubricin. But this is going to be like a piece of leather underneath the beam. So where does that set? Do you guys see how that manica flexora sets right in that groove that's made right here? So this area, you guys notice it looks like a Pringle?
Yeah.
A hyperbolic parabola is that shape. Okay, it's as far as engineering goes, it's one of the strongest shapes. The Pringle guy made a batter that tasted really good, but then he couldn't keep it together, right? So he went to an engineer and he said, what can we do about this? And so they came up with this shape. That's how it came up, but that's how Pringles got their shape. Anyway, this is scutum, and underneath that is your intersesamoidian ligament, okay? Without an R, right, Andy?
Sorry.
Yeah. Do you spell scutum with an R? No. Yeah, so it sets underneath there, okay? Now, look how our palmar annular ligament, look how that wraps around. It comes right off that scutum and wraps around our tendons. But this rides right there in that shape, and it acts as that piece of leather. So it protects my deep flexor tendon, okay? So let's go ahead and cut one side of that off. Fetch. No, just kidding. So right here, a few things we can kind of show off. This is our suspensory ligament. Look at its origin, okay? Right? So in the palm of our hand, if you guys Google interosseous muscle, interosseous tendon, our hand, actually we have interosseous muscles in them that help flex our fingers, okay? This right here is the interosseous muscle, but look how it has multiple heads to its origin. You guys see that? I never really understood it. That's one thing I never understood when I started doing dissections. I always thought it was like just one tendon that inserted into one spot. But look at how that has multiple heads. So you'll see that most times, think about if you're ultrasounding that, right? They say that almost all suspensory ligament injuries are they happen in that proximal third, or that proximal really high suspensory injury. But how would you really diagnose that? That'd be pretty hard if you couldn't see the actual striations, because each one of those black holes would look like a tear, right? So when you get a suspensory ligament in the future, if you guys are ever getting that, you really want to make sure that you have left and right so that you can compare what's normal anatomy for that horse. So it courses distat, it bifurcates. You can see how clean that is. See how it inserts into our sesamoids? It courses dorsodistat and inserts into the main extensor tendon about the level of our passionate. Okay? Next thing we're going to see, this is our straight or superficial sesamoidian ligament. Like I said, our inner sesamoidian ligament was under here. Our straight is here, and our oblique sits to the side of it. In a second, I'm going to cut that back. Now, remember us talking about short bones being really good for concussion reduction, right? But how does that work? So think about what happens when Fluffy, and look at these collateral ligaments. Look how it maintains the same length throughout all of that articulation. And it's pretty complicated articulation, but it maintains that same kind of general length. And even crisscrosses on the other side. Isn't that really neat, that design? So, all right, so now when we're under weight bearing, what happens as we flex this leg? So as we flex this leg, what you have in between each carpal bone is called an intercarpal ligament, right? Look at this intercarpal ligament here. What direction is it pointing? How about now?
Oh.
Oh.
It changes directions. So if you guys look at the distal end of a radius, you guys look at the distal end of this radius right here. Do you guys see how the condyles on it are not flat, are not even with each other? Why is that? How does it work? We can really see how much flexion. You can see in that mid-carpal joint, we can see that all our flexions happen in the palmar third, right? On our radial carpal joint, it's happening in the palmar 2/3. You guys agree with that? Okay, so watch what happens. So again, put your hand out in front of you, ulna, and then radius, which one's medial, which one's lateral, right? So we have our accessory carpal, right? This is our intermediate carpal, this is our radial carpal, and our ulnar carpal is here, okay? So ulnar, intermediate, radial. So what happens when Fluffy goes out and he extends his leg out? Well, guess what happens? The first bone to hit is the radial carpal bone. Do you guys look at this third carpal? Do you guys see how it has a ridge and a slope off to your left-hand side? Yeah. So what happens? It arrests the extension of this joint. It slows it down just enough. So imagine if this didn't have this. It would be like a belly flop. Can you imagine if the first time, every time Fluffy extended, if it was stacked rock, if those rocks just hit like this? If they just hit, you're talking about a tremendous amount of force and would likely to cause a fracture, right? But what if I had something that came out and arrested that? Just a little bit. What if it hit here, then slid into place? Then I could arrest that extension just a little bit. I could slow it down just slightly so that it isn't a belly flop. Yeah? So look what happens. Look at our radiocarpal. Your radiocarpal ends up bearing most weight. It's a pretty common fracture that you'll see in racehorses. So again, look at the radius, the condyle, intercarpal ligament. Right now is trying to pull that radiocarpal up. Now as I extend, now it's trying to keep it flat. Now it's trying to pull it down. And you can see C3, the radial carpal, is sliding down that. And as it bears weight, C3, that ridge in the center of it, is trying to cause our carpal bones to go out. So as they go out, that energy that was coming up is now going into my intercarpal ligaments. Energy is not made or spent, right? Like it's there, right? So we have to change its direction. Right? So that's what's happened is the intercarpal ligaments are now taking on that energy that was coming up. Isn't that cool? So this is one of the times that the more you understand, the easier it is to remember. So when you guys are trying to learn to draw your carpals, start conceptualizing the way they're functioning. Once you do that, it's pretty easy to start remembering how big a joint you have, think about how they all line up with each other. This accessory carpal is always hard to get around. So when you look at that, slippery, how offset is the distal end of that bone? Not very, is it? Right? It's not very offset at all. How about now? Right? So as I flex and this rotates around, it's going to push our carpal bones into different locations. Does that make sense? And that's all because of the condyle there. So articular cartilage, why is it? That's like the holy grail of stem cells is articular cartilage. Like if they could ever grow back articular cartilage, they've really done it. Articular cartilage doesn't have much innervation, which doesn't mean it has much blood supply. Okay, well innervation means actual filling, but it doesn't have a lot of blood supply. Most things that don't have innervation, don't have filling, don't have a lot of blood supply. On the flip side, would you guys want to fill your articular cartilage with every stride? No, right? So it acts as a concussion reduction. It acts as, it's like 4 layers of high-laying cartilage. And so as you compress it, it actually squeezes out, and secretes just a little bit of synovium that helps with the lubrication. Okay, so it's actually a really neat structure when you start studying it. But with that, the problem is I wouldn't want to feel it, and it doesn't want to be felt. Same with digital cushion, it doesn't want to be felt. But when it gets injured, it can't heal itself, right? So whenever think about us living 80 years, hopefully, you know, maybe not. As we live, if we tear up that cartilage, it can't heal itself throughout our life. So then that's why you end up having to have joint replacements. That's why those things end up happening. Okay. All right, so the next thing is I'm going to go ahead and cut this straight sesamoid ligament back. So watch how I go about this. I'm going to start on the distal side. I'm going to push up. Now in Dad's textbook, this is drawn, your oblique is only drawn with 2 legs to it, right? But in function, your oblique actually has 3 parts to it. I really encourage you guys to ask the why and the how. And once you start asking that, it makes the carpal bones, when you have to learn to draw them, way easier to understand. So when Dad wrote his textbook, he didn't know about this. But do you guys see that chicken foot? Yeah, see how there's 3 parts? That is part of your oblique sesamoid ligament. So there's not very many textbooks that actually show that. Huh? Yeah. So that middle piece right there is not in many textbooks. There's one coloring atlas that I know of. I can't remember if Sisson and Grossman had it in his book or not. But yeah, that's the 3rd part of your oblique sesamoid ligament that you won't see very often. Cool? All right, so now we're going to go ahead and cut back this oblique. And underneath, if you guys look really closely, you guys are going to have to get right in here. But just under here, you're going to start to see 2 little structures right there that are kind of creating a cross. Crucifixion, cruciate.
Okay.
That's our deep sesamoid ligament, okay? So you can see this side of the cruciate is going from my lateral sesamoid to my medial proximal P1. Yeah? And then this one is going from my medial sesamoid to my lateral P1. The short sesamoid, your short sesamoid ligament, is going to go from the medial sesamoid to the medial side of P1. Yeah, the next thing is if I can get, I didn't talk anything about our collateral cartilages. This horse, again, having that wire cut kind of changed the things. Did you guys see this here?
Wow.
That's what we can feel. That's our collateral cartilage there.
I feel it.
Yep.
Whoa. Chill. If I get you a little bit. Wait, which side's nothing there?
There. So if we look here, we can see as P2, as this descends, what happens? It's going to not push against our coronary band, but our P2 is going to push against our collateral cartilage. P1 and P2 are going to push against our collateral cartilages, pushing against the outside of our coronary band. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And then if we look down here, we can see this is all our digital cushion. So as that bears weight, that's also going to be pushing. So if we look right down in here, this little trampoline where we can't get our finger through is our T-ligament or transverse laminar ligament. Okay, and we're going to get a better view of that. If someone can get me a pair of nippers and pull-offs. All right, so just a little bit of outside anatomy to be able to see where things are. The wing of the coffin bone, if you went up from the seat of corn, if you go straight up from the seat of corn, you'll find the wing of the coffin bone. On a trimmed foot, halfway between the apex of the frog and the white line is where you find the distal dorsal border. That doesn't make a lot of sense when you're looking at it from the bottom. You're like, shouldn't that go right up to the white line? Yeah, but when you think about it, we're looking at a taper, right? So if I have something here, if I'm looking at the bottom of a taper, the deeper I go in, right? So we're here at this taper, the deeper I go in, the more it comes back. You guys agree with that? So that's why when we're looking at this, if I told you the wing of the coffin bone was right here, looking at the lateral side, you would believe me, right? If I told you the distal dorsal border of the coffin bone looking from the side would be there, you would believe me. Yeah? But if you looked at it from the bottom, I told you it would be here and it would be here, you'd be like, it's kind of hard to conceptualize. But remember, because you're on a taper, that's why that changes, okay? So then we'll just pull that apart, and that's our lamina giving up. It's a bit more like a phone book on top of each other. Velcro is going to be more like your sole.
You see a phone book?
Yeah, if you took 2 phone books and stacked one page at a time.
I got my face.
That guy in your face.
Perfect trim, Katie.
Yeah. Look at the shape of the frog though, right? This is a bit of an atrophied frog. But when you guys hear me say, when I trim the frog, I want to take everything I have to and leave everything I can. So coming straight up from the bottom of my commissure, straight up, as long as I don't come into the side of the frog, I can't stick them. Because our frog doesn't have a T shape to the top of it, does it? It has this taper shape to it. So as long as I stay straight and I don't cut in, that's how I trim my frog. Does that make sense?
Yes.
How do you go about trimming the top of it?
When you trim the sides, usually the top sorts itself out because you're on a triangle. Yeah. But does that make sense how I said that? Now when we look, there's the wing of coffin bone, there's the wing of our coffin bone. If we put Fluffy back together again, if we pretend we're all the king's men and all the king's horses, we're putting Fluffy back together again, guess where the seat of corn is? Right there. Before my first nip. We pull that back, where's the wing of our coffin bone? Right? So when you see a corn, what's causing a corn? It's not necessarily what's pressing up, but think about when that P2 descends, it's going to pull on the caudal aspect, pushing against this digital cushion. That's going to push against your seat of corn. So it's actually your wing of your coffin bone pushing down as much as it is your pushing up.
Fix that problem, Would you like to try something next time?
I'm gonna get into this. Sounds like frozen.
It sounds like bone.
Yeah. But like ice, you know, when you.
I have to put a disclaimer on this video.
Let's pull our deep flexor tendon back. We can see that's right where our navicular bone's going to set. Whoop. You guys see that? So when you guys are thinking about your suspensory navicular ligament, how far around the dorsal side do you guys think it is? All right. So we've got a lot of anatomy right here, okay? So right here is our navicular bone. Right here is our transverse lamina ligament. So you guys can see how it's separating. So you guys can come and pass this around if you want or whatever. But look here. Right there's our navicular bone. You guys see that? You guys should pass this around and look at it. There's our navicular bone. There's our suspensory navicular ligament. You guys see how it's almost perpendicular to the ground? And it comes and it inserts almost all the way around your dorsal side of P1. How many of you guys would have drawn it that far around the dorsal side? That's where textbooks just don't do you justice, right? It comes all the way up past P2 and all the way around that dorsal aspect of P1. Isn't that cool? Now the next thing is, this is our T ligament. So how does the T ligament work? Our synovial sheath comes down and inserts into P2, okay? This is gonna allow the coffin joint, right? So we have our coffin joint here. Here's our navicular bone. So to separate our coffin joint and our prototrochlear bursa, how to separate those two. So there's the dorsal surface of the navicular bone, right? So that's your coffin joint. This is your prototrochlear bursa, okay? And you have a tissue that lies right in between there. And that's what makes up that T ligament. You guys all see that?
Thank you, sir.
Happily. Huh. One time, huh?